The Man in the Brown Suit by Agatha Christie. Chapter 10. I was violently excited. I was sure that I had hit on the right trail at last. One thing was clear: I must not move out of the cabin. The asafoetida had got to be born. I examined my facts again. Tomorrow was the 22nd, and at 1 a.m. or 1 p.m. something would happen. I plumped for 1 a.m. It was now 7 o'clock. In 6 hours, I should know. I don't know how I got through the evening. I retired to my cabin fairly early. I had told the stewardess that I had a cold in the head and didn't mind smells. She still seemed distressed, but I was firm. The evening seemed interminable. I duly retired to bed, but in view of emergencies, I swathed myself in a thick flannel dressing gown and encased my feet in slippers. Thus attired, I felt that I could spring up and take an active part in anything that happened. What did I expect to happen? I hardly knew. Vague fancies, most of them wildly improbable, flitted through my brain. But one thing I was firmly convinced of: at 1 o'clock something would happen. At various times, I heard my fellow passengers coming to bed. Fragments of conversation, laughing goodnights, floated in through the open transom. Then, silence. Most of the lights went out. There was still one in the passage outside, and there was therefore a certain amount of light in my cabin. I heard 8 bells go. The hour that followed seemed the longest I had ever known. I consulted my watch surreptitiously to be sure I had not overshot the time. If my deductions were wrong, if nothing happened at 1 o'clock, I should have made a fool of myself and spent all the money I had in the world on a mare's nest. My heart beat painfully. 2 bells went overhead. 1 o'clock. And nothing. Wait, what was that? I heard the quick light patter of feet running along the passage. Then, with the suddenness of a bombshell, my cabin door burst open and a man almost fell inside. Save me, he said hoarsely. They're after me. It was not a moment for argument or explanation. I could hear footsteps outside. I had about 40 seconds in which to act. I had sprung to my feet and was standing facing the stranger in the middle of the cabin. A cabin does not abound in hiding places for a 6 foot man. With one arm, I pulled out my cabin trunk. He slipped down behind it under the bunk. I raised the lid. At the same time, with the other hand, I pulled down the wash basin. A deft movement, and my hair was screwed into a tiny knot on the top of my head. From the point of view of appearance, it was inartistic. From another standpoint, it was supremely artistic. A lady, with her hair screwed into an unbecoming knob and in the act of removing a piece of soap from her trunk with which, apparently to wash her neck, could hardly be suspected of harboring a fugitive. There was a knock at the door, and without waiting for me to say, "Come in," it was pushed open. I don't know what I expected to see. I think I had vague ideas of Mr. Paget brandishing a revolver, or my missionary friend with a sandbag, or some other lethal weapon. But certainly I did not expect to see a night stewardess with an inquiring face and looking the essence of respectability. "I beg your pardon, miss, I thought you called out." "No," I said, "I didn't. I'm sorry for interrupting you." "That's all right," I said. "I couldn't sleep. I thought a wash would do me good." It sounded rather as though it were a thing I never had as a general rule. "I'm so sorry, miss," said the stewardess again. "But there's a gentleman about who's rather drunk, and we are afraid he might get into one of the ladies' cabins and frighten them." "How dreadful," I said, looking alarmed. "He won't come in here, will he?" "Oh, I don't think so, miss. Ring the bell if he does. Good night. Good night. I opened the door and peeped down the corridor. Except for the retreating form of the stewardess, there was nobody in sight. Drunk. So that was the explanation of it. My histrionic talents had been wasted. I pulled the cabin trunk out a little farther and said, "Come out at once, please," in an acid voice. There was no answer. I peered under the bunk. My visitor lay immovable. He seemed to be asleep. I tugged at his shoulder. He did not move. Dead drunk, I thought vexedly. What am I to do? Then I saw something that made me catch my breath, a small scarlet spot on the floor. Using all my strength, I succeeded in dragging the man out into the middle of the cabin. The dead whiteness of his face showed that he had fainted. I found the cause of his fainting easily enough. He had been stabbed under the left shoulder blade, a nasty deep wound. I got his coat off and set to work to attend to it. At the sting of the cold water, he stirred, then sat up. "Keep still, please," I said. He was the kind of young man who recovers his faculties very quickly. He pulled himself to his feet and stood there swaying a little. "Thank you, I don't need anything done for me." His manner was defiant, almost aggressive. Not a word of thanks, of even common gratitude. "That is a nasty wound. You must let me dress it." "You will do nothing of the kind." He flung the words in my face as though I had been begging a favor of him. My temper, never placid, rose. "I cannot congratulate you upon your manners," I said coldly. "I can at least relieve you of my presence." He started for the door, but reeled as he did so. With an abrupt movement, I pushed him down upon the sofa. "Don't be a fool," I said unceremoniously. "You don't want to go bleeding all over the ship, do you?" He seemed to see the sense of that, for he sat quietly whilst I bandaged up the wound as best I could. "There," I said, bestowing a pat on my handiwork, "that will have to do for the present. Are you better tempered now, and do you feel inclined to tell me what it's all about?" "I'm sorry that I can't satisfy your very natural curiosity." "Why not?" I said, chagrined. He smiled nastily. "If you want a thing broadcasted, tell a woman. Otherwise, keep your mouth shut. Don't you think I could keep a secret?" "I don't think, I know." He rose to his feet. "At any rate," I said spitefully, "I shall be able to do a little broadcasting about the events of this evening." "I've no doubt you will too," he said indifferently. "How dare you?" I cried angrily. We were facing each other, glaring at each other with the ferocity of bitter enemies. For the first time, I took in the details of his appearance: the close cropped dark head, the lean jaw, the scar on the brown cheek, the curious light grey eyes that looked into mine with a sort of reckless mockery hard to describe. There was something dangerous about him. "You haven't thanked me yet for saving your life," I said with false sweetness. I hit him there. I saw him flinch distinctly. Intuitively, I knew that he hated above all to be reminded that he owed his life to me. I didn't care. I wanted to hurt him. I had never wanted to hurt anyone so much. "I wish to God you hadn't," he said explosively. "I'd be better dead and out of it." "I'm glad you acknowledge the debt. You can't get out of it. I saved your life and I'm waiting for you to say thank you." If looks could have killed, I think he would have liked to kill me then. He pushed roughly past me. At the door, he turned back and spoke over his shoulder. I shall not thank you, now or at any other time. But I acknowledge the debt. Some day I will pay it. He was gone, leaving me with clenched hands and my heart beating like a mill race. Chapter 11. There were no further excitements that night. I had breakfast in bed and got up late the next morning. Mrs. Blair hailed me as I came on deck. "Good morning, gypsy girl, sit down here by me. You look as though you hadn't slept well." "Why do you call me that?" I asked as I sat down obediently. "Do you mind?" "It suits you somehow. I've called you that in my own mind from the beginning. It's the gypsy element in you that makes you so different from anyone else. I decided in my own mind that you and Colonel Reyes were the only two people on board who wouldn't bore me to death to talk to." "That's funny," I said. "I thought the same about you, only it's more understandable in your case. You're, you're such an exquisitely finished product." "Not badly put," said Mrs. Blair, nodding her head. "Tell me all about yourself, gypsy girl. Why are you going to South Africa?" I told her something about Papa's life work. "So you're Charles Bedingfield's daughter? I thought you weren't a mere provincial miss. Are you going to Broken Hill to grub up more skulls?" "I may," I said cautiously. "I've got other plans as well." "What a mysterious minx you are. But you do look tired this morning. Didn't you sleep well?" "I can't keep awake on board a boat. 10 hours sleep for a fool, they say. I could do with 20. She yawned, looking like a sleepy kitten. "An idiot of a steward woke me up in the middle of the night to return me that roll of films I dropped yesterday. He did it in the most melodramatic manner, stuck his arm through the ventilator and dropped them nearly in the middle of my tummy. I thought it was a bomb for a moment." "Here's your colonel," I said, as the tall soldierly figure of Colonel Reyes appeared on the deck. "He's not my colonel particularly. In fact, he admires you very much, gypsy girl. So don't run away. I want to tie something round my head. It will be more comfortable than a hat." I slipped quickly away. For some reason or other, I was uncomfortable with Colonel Reyes. He was one of the few people who were capable of making me feel shy. I went down to my cabin and began looking for a broad band of ribbon or a motor veil with which I could restrain my rebellious locks. Now I am a tidy person. I like my things always arranged in a certain way and I keep them so. I had no sooner opened my drawer than I realized that somebody had been disarranging my things. Everything had been turned over and scattered. I looked in the other drawers and the small hanging cupboard. They told me the same tale. It was as though someone had been making a hurried and ineffectual search for something. I sat down on the edge of the bunk with a grave face. Who had been searching my cabin and what had they been looking for? Was it the half sheet of paper with scribbled figures and words? I shook my head, dissatisfied. Surely that was past history now. But what else could there be? I wanted to think. The events of last night, though exciting, had not really done anything to elucidate matters. Who was the young man who had burst into my cabin so abruptly? I had not seen him on board previously, either on deck or in the saloon. Was he one of the ship's company or was he a passenger? Who had stabbed him? Why had they stabbed him? And why, in the name of goodness, should cabin number 17 figure so prominently? It was all a mystery, but there was no doubt that some very peculiar occurrences were taking place on the Kilmorden Castle. I counted off on my fingers the people on whom it behoved me to keep a watch. Setting aside my visitor of the night before, but promising myself that I would discover him on board before another day had passed, I selected the following persons as worthy of my notice. 1. Sir Eustace Pedler. He was the owner of the mill house, and his presence on the Kilmordon Castle seemed something of a coincidence. 2. Mr. Paget, the sinister looking secretary, whose eagerness to obtain cabin 17 had been so very marked. NB find out whether he had accompanied Sir Eustace to Cannes. 3. The Rev. Edward Chichester. All I had against him was his obstinacy over cabin 17, and that might be entirely due to his own peculiar temperament. Obstinacy can be an amazing thing. But a little conversation with Mr. Chichester would not come amiss, I decided. Hastily tying a handkerchief round my rebellious locks, I went up on deck again, full of purpose. I was in luck. My quarry was leaning against the rail, drinking beef tea. I went up to him. "I hope you've forgiven me over cabin 17, I said, with my best smile. "I consider it unchristian to bear a grudge," said Mr. Chichester coldly. "But the purser had distinctly promised me that cabin." "Pursers are such busy men, aren't they?" I said vaguely. "I suppose they're bound to forget sometimes." Mr. Chichester did not reply. "Is this your first visit to Africa?" I inquired conversationally. "To South Africa, yes. But I have worked for the last 2 years amongst the cannibal tribes in the interior of East Africa." "How thrilling! Have you had many narrow escapes?" "Escapes? Of being eaten, I mean." "You should not treat sacred subjects with levity, Miss Bedingfeld." "I didn't know that cannibalism was a sacred subject," I retorted, stung. As the words left my lips, another idea struck me. If Mr. Chichester had indeed spent the last 2 years in the interior of Africa, how was it that he was not more sunburnt? His skin was as pink and white as a baby's. Surely there was something fishy there? Yet his manner and voice were so absolutely it. Too much so, perhaps. Was he, or was he not, just a little like a stage clergyman? I cast my mind back to the curates I had known at Little Hamsley. Some of them I had liked, some of them I had not, but certainly none of them had been quite like Mr. Chichester. They had been human, he was a glorified type. I was debating all this when Sir Eustace Pedler passed down the deck. Just as he was abreast of Mr. Chichester, he stooped and picked up a piece of paper which he handed to him, remarking, "You've dropped something." He passed on without stopping, and so probably did not notice Mr. Chichester's agitation. I did. Whatever it was he had dropped, its recovery agitated him considerably. He turned a sickly green and crumpled up the sheet of paper into a ball. My suspicions were accentuated 100-fold. He caught my eye and hurried into explanations. A fragment of a sermon I was composing," he said with a sickly smile. "Indeed," I rejoined politely. "A fragment of a sermon, indeed. No, Mr. Chichester, too weak for words." He soon left me with a muttered excuse. I wished, oh, how I wished, that I had been the one to pick up that paper and not Sir Eustace Pedler. One thing was clear, Mr. Chichester could not be exempted from my list of suspects. I was inclined to put him top of the three. After lunch, when I came up to the lounge for coffee, I noticed Sir Eustace and Paget sitting with Mrs. Blair and Colonel Race. Mrs. Blair welcomed me with a smile, so I went over and joined them. They were talking about Italy. "But it is misleading," Mrs. Blair insisted. "Aqua calda certainly ought to be cold water, not hot." "You're not a Latin scholar," said Sir Eustace, smiling. Men are so superior about their Latin, said Mrs. Blair. But all the same, I notice that when you ask them to translate inscriptions in old churches, they can never do it. They hem and haw and get out of it somehow. Quite right, said Colonel Reyes. I always do. But I love the Italians, continued Mrs. Blair. They're so obliging, though even that has its embarrassing side. You ask them the way somewhere, and instead of saying first to the right, second to the left, or something that one could follow, they pour out a flood of well meaning directions, and when you look bewildered, they take you kindly by the arm and walk all the way there with you. Is that your experience in Florence, Paget? Asked Sir Eustace, turning with a smile to his secretary. For some reason, the question seemed to disconcert Mr. Paget. He stammered and flushed. Oh, quite so, yes, quite so. Then, with a murmured excuse, he rose and left the table. I am beginning to suspect Guy Paget of having committed some dark deed in Florence, remarked Sir Eustace, gazing after his secretary's retreating figure. Whenever Florence or Italy is mentioned, he changes the subject, or bolts precipitately. Perhaps he murdered someone there, said Mrs. Blair hopefully. He looks, I hope I'm not hurting your feelings, Sir Eustace, but he does look as though he might murder someone. Yes, pure cinquento. It amuses me sometimes, especially when one knows as well as I do how essentially law abiding and respectable the poor fellow really is. He's been with you some time, hasn't he, Sir Eustace? Asked Colonel Reyes. 6 years, said Sir Eustace, with a deep sigh. He must be quite invaluable to you, said Mrs. Blair. Oh, invaluable. Yes, quite invaluable. The poor man sounded even more depressed, as though the invaluableness of Mr. Paget was a secret grief to him. Then he added more briskly, but his face should really inspire you with confidence, my dear lady. No self respecting murderer would ever consent to look like one. Crippen, now, I believe, was one of the pleasantest fellows imaginable. He was caught on a liner, wasn't he? Murmured Mrs. Blair. There was a slight rattle behind us. I turned quickly. Mr. Chichester had dropped his coffee cup. Our party soon broke up. Mrs. Blair went below to sleep and I went out on deck. Colonel Reyes followed me. You're very elusive, Miss Bedingfeld. I looked for you everywhere last night at the dance. I went to bed early, I explained. Are you going to run away tonight too? Or are you going to dance with me? I shall be very pleased to dance with you, I murmured shyly. But Mrs. Blair, our friend, Mrs. Blair, doesn't care for dancing. And you do. I care for dancing with you. Oh, I said nervously. I was a little afraid of Colonel Reyes. Nevertheless, I was enjoying myself. This was better than discussing fossilized skulls with stuffy old professors. Colonel Reyes was really just my ideal of a stern, silent Rhodesian. Possibly I might marry him. I hadn't been asked, it is true, but, as the Boy Scouts say, be prepared. And all women, without in the least meaning it, consider every man they meet as a possible husband for themselves or for their best friend. I danced several times with him that evening. He danced well. When the dancing was over, and I was thinking of going to bed, he suggested a turn round the deck. We walked round 3 times and finally subsided into 2 deck chairs. There was nobody else in sight. We made desultory conversation for some time. Do you know, Miss Bedingfeld, I think that I once met your father? A very interesting man, on his own subject, and it's a subject that has a special fascination for me. In my humble way, I've done a bit in that line myself. Why, when I was in the Dordogne region, our talk became technical. Colonel Race's boast was not an idle one. He knew a great deal. At the same time, he made one or two curious mistakes, slips of the tongue. I might almost have thought them. But he was quick to take his cue from me and to cover them up. Once he spoke of the Mousterian period as succeeding the Aurignacian, an absurd mistake for one who knew anything of the subject. It was 12 o'clock when I went to my cabin. I was still puzzling over those queer discrepancies. Was it possible that he had got the whole subject up for the occasion? That really he knew nothing of archaeology? I shook my head, vaguely dissatisfied with that solution. Just as I was dropping off to sleep, I sat up with a sudden start as another idea flashed into my head. Had he been pumping me? Were those slight inaccuracies just tests to see whether I really knew what I was talking about? In other words, he suspected me of not being genuinely and Bedingfeld. Why? Chapter 12. Extract from the diary of Sir Eustace Pedler. There is something to be said for life on board ship. It is peaceful. My grey hairs fortunately exempt me from the indignities of bobbing for apples, running up and down the deck with potatoes and eggs, and the more painful sports of Brother Bill and Bolster Bar. What amusement people can find in these painful proceedings has always been a mystery to me. But there are many fools in the world. One praises God for their existence and keeps out of their way. Fortunately, I am an excellent sailor. Paget, poor fellow, is not. He began turning green as soon as we were out of the Solent. I presume my other so-called secretary is also seasick. At any rate, he has not yet made his appearance. But perhaps it is not seasickness, but high diplomacy. The great thing is that I have not been worried by him. On the whole, the people on board are a mangy lot. Only two decent bridge players and one decent-looking woman, Mrs. Clarence Blair. I've met her in town, of course. She is one of the only women I know who can lay claim to a sense of humor. I enjoy talking to her, and should enjoy it more if it were not for a long-legged taciturn as who has attached himself to her like a limpet. I cannot think that this Colonel Reyes really amuses her. He's good-looking in his way, but dull as ditch water. One of these strong, silent men that lady novelists and young girls always rave over. Guy Paget struggled up on deck after we left Madeira and began babbling in a hollow voice about work. What the devil does anyone want to work for on board ship? It is true that I promised my publishers my reminiscences early in the summer, but what of it? Who really reads reminiscences? Old ladies in the suburbs. And what do my reminiscences amount to? I've knocked against a certain number of so-called famous people in my lifetime. With the assistance of Paget, I invent insipid anecdotes about them. And the truth of the matter is, Paget is too honest for the job. He won't let me invent anecdotes about the people I might have met but haven't. I tried kindness with him. You look a perfect wreck still, my dear chap, I said easily. What you need is a deck chair in the sun. No, not another word. The work must wait. The next thing I knew, he was worrying about an extra cabin. There's no room to work in your cabin, Sir Eustace. It's full of trunks. From his tone, you might have thought that trunks were black beetles, something that had no business to be there. I explained to him that, though he might not be aware of the fact, it was usual to take a change of clothing with one when traveling. He gave the wan smile with which he always greets my attempts at humor, and then reverted to the business in hand. And we could hardly work in my little hole. I know Paget's little holes, he usually has the best cabin on the ship. I'm sorry the captain didn't turn out for you this time, I said sarcastically. Perhaps you'd like to dump some of your extra luggage in my cabin. Sarcasm is dangerous with a man like Paget. He brightened up at once. Well, if I could get rid of the typewriter and the stationery trunk. The stationery trunk weighs several solid tons. It causes endless unpleasantness with the porters, and it is the aim of Paget's life to foist it on me. It is a perpetual struggle between us. He seems to regard it as my special personal property. I, on the other hand, regard the charge of it as the only thing where a secretary is really useful. We'll get an extra cabin, I said hastily. The thing seemed simple enough, but Paget is a person who loves to make mysteries. He came to me the next day with a face like a Renaissance conspirator. You know, you told me to get cabin 17 for an office. Well, what of it? Has the stationery trunk jammed in the doorway? The doorways are the same size in all the cabins, replied Paget seriously. But I tell you, Sir Eustace, there's something very queer about that cabin. Memories of reading the upper berth floated through my mind. If you mean that it's haunted, I said, we're not going to sleep there, so I don't see that it matters. Ghosts don't affect typewriters. Paget said that it wasn't a ghost, and that, after all, he hadn't got cabin 17. He told me a long, garbled story. Apparently he and a Mr. Chichester and a girl called Bedingfeld had almost come to blows over the cabin. Needless to say, the girl had won, and Paget was apparently feeling sore over the matter. Both 13 and 28 are better cabins, he reiterated. But they wouldn't look at them. Well, I said, stifling a yawn, for that matter, no more would you, my dear Paget. He gave me a reproachful look. You told me to get cabin 17. There is a touch of the boy upon the burning deck about Paget. My dear fellow, I said testily, I mentioned number 17 because I happened to observe that it was vacant. But I didn't mean you to make a stand to the death about it. 13 or 28 would have done us equally well. He looked hurt. There's something more, though, he insisted. Miss Bedingfeld got the cabin, but this morning I saw Chichester coming out of it in a furtive sort of way. I looked at him severely. If you're trying to get up a nasty scandal about Chichester, who is a missionary, though a perfectly poisonous person, and that attractive child, and Bedingfeld, I don't believe a word of it, I said coldly. And Bedingfeld is an extremely nice girl, with particularly good legs. I should say she had far and away the best legs on board. Paget did not like my reference to Anne Bedingfeld's legs. He is the sort of man who never notices legs himself, or, if he does, would die sooner than say so. Also, he thinks my appreciation of such things frivolous. I like annoying Paget, so I continued maliciously. As you've made her acquaintance, you might ask her to dine at our table tomorrow night. It's the fancy dress dance. By the way, you'd better go down to the barber and select a fancy costume for me. Surely you will not go in fancy dress, said Paget, in tones of horror. I could see that it was quite incompatible with his idea of my dignity. He looked shocked and pained. I had really had no intention of donning fancy dress, but the complete discomfiture of Paget was too tempting to be forborne. What do you mean? I said. Of course I shall wear fancy dress. So will you. Paget shuddered. So go down to the barber's and see about it, I finished. I don't think he'll have any outsizes, murmured Paget, measuring my figure with his eye. Without meaning it, Paget can occasionally be extremely offensive. And order a table for 6 in the saloon, I said. We'll have the captain, the girl with the nice legs, Mrs. Blair. You won't get Mrs. Blair without Colonel Ray's, Paget interposed. He's asked her to dine with him, I know. Paget always knows everything. I was justifiably annoyed. Who is Race? I demanded, exasperated. As I said before, Paget always knows everything, or thinks he does. He looked mysterious again. They say he's a Secret Service chap, Sir Eustace. Rather a great gun, too. But of course, I don't know for certain. Isn't that like the government? I exclaimed. Here's a man on board whose business it is to carry about secret documents, and they go giving them to a peaceful outsider who only asks to be let alone. Paget looked even more mysterious. He came a pace nearer and dropped his voice. If you ask me, the whole thing is very queer, Sir Eustace. Look at that illness of mine before we started. My dear fellow, I interrupted brutally, that was a bilious attack. You're always having bilious attacks. Paget winced slightly. It wasn't the usual sort of bilious attack. This time. For God's sake, don't go into the details of your condition, Paget. I don't want to hear them. Very well, Sir Eustace. But my belief is that I was deliberately poisoned. Oh, I said. You've been talking to Rayburn. He did not deny it. At any rate, Sir Eustace, he thinks so, and he should be in a position to know. By the way, where is the chap? I asked. I've not set eyes on him since we came on board. He gives out that he's ill and stays in his cabin, Sir Eustace. Paget's voice dropped again. But that's camouflage, I'm sure. So that he can watch better. Watch. Over your safety, Sir Eustace. In case an attack should be made upon you. You're such a cheerful fellow, Paget, I said. I trust that your imagination runs away with you. If I were you, I should go to the dance as a death's head or an executioner. It will suit your mournful style of beauty. That shut him up for the time being. I went on deck. The Bedingfeld girl was deep in conversation with the missionary parson, Chichester. Women always flutter round parsons. A man of my figure hates stooping, but I had the courtesy to pick up a bit of paper that was fluttering round the parson's feet. I got no word of thanks for my pains. As a matter of fact, I couldn't help seeing what was written on the sheet of paper. There was just one sentence. Don't try to play a lone hand or it will be the worse for you. That's a nice thing for a parson to have. Who is this fellow Chichester, I wonder? He looks mild as milk. But looks are deceptive. I shall ask Paget about him. Paget always knows everything. I sunk gracefully into my deck chair by the side of Mrs. Blair, thereby interrupting her tete-a-tete with Race, and remarked that I didn't know what the clergy were coming to nowadays. Then I asked her to dine with me on the night of the fancy dress dance. Somehow or other Race managed to get included in the invitation. After lunch, the Bedingfeld girl came and sat with us for coffee. I was right about her legs. They are the best on the ship. I shall certainly ask her to dinner as well. I would very much like to know what mischief Paget was up to in Florence. Whenever Italy is mentioned, he goes to pieces. If I did not know how intensely respectable he is, I should suspect him of some disreputable amour. I wonder now. Even the most respectable men, it would cheer me up enormously if it was so. Paget, with a guilty secret. Splendid.